what was it like? Let me start with you, Sir Richard, when you realised that the big prize was yours, the eureka moment.
It was pretty good, but my initial reaction was I was working, writing a paper, 6 o'clock in the morning. My wife was in bed, and we have a phone at the side of the bed, and the phone rang. And I go to answer it, and it turns out it's CNN News, who say, "Have you heard the news this morning?" To which I said, "Why would I be watching CNN at 6 o'clock in the morning?" And I was quite annoyed, and then they said, "Well, it's just been announced you've won the Nobel Prize." So it seemed pretty good after that.
That's quite something for CNN to break the news.
Yes.
I'm proud of my
In fact, the
colleagues
Swedes didn't get through to me until about 11 o'clock in the morning.
Is that right?
They had to break through the regular service. They had my wrong phone number. That was the
Wow,
problem.
good news sources at CNN. Let me come to you, Professor Michael Levitt. What was the moment like for you?
So I was in California, and it's not 6 in the morning, it's 2:15 in the morning. And any sane person goes to sleep because you should never expect the Nobel Prize. Dropped the phone, they phoned back, and did something very interesting. Because in California it's at 2 in the morning, a lot of prank calls. It's really fun to call your friends who think they should be getting a Nobel Prize, put on a Swedish accent, and say, "This is the Nobel Foundation," or whatever. I can't do a Swedish accent. But then they immediately put on the phone friends in Sweden who asked me questions, who told me things that only they would know. Like, "You owe me that review," or "Next time you want to go sea kayaking by yourself, come sailing with me." And as a result, it suddenly became true. And it's an incredible high. I mean, I don't know, 7 double espressos or something like that, a real high. It's kind of amazing. It's unusual. Most prizes, you sort of know you're in the running. The Nobel Prize, you generally don't know you're even in the running. So it's not like winning an Oscar or winning a medal at the Olympics. You don't actually know it's you until you hear the news. So it's a big high.
It's incredible. I imagine with that comes great responsibility. The realization is one thing. The high is momentary, but there is a responsibility that goes with that, right? Talk to me about that.
Very much so. So one of the most difficult things is that before you win the Nobel Prize, you can talk about things, you can give your opinion, and sometimes people listen, but rarely do they act on it. As soon as you win a Nobel Prize, people all of a sudden think you're very smart and have a lot of good things, have knowledge of everything, not just your subject. And I discovered that there are people who listen who previously hadn't listened, but then they would act on it. And one of the things that I've been trying to do during the 30 years since I won the prize is to really take advantage of the fact that if we get a few Nobel laureates together, we can take on some good humanitarian causes, we can take on some good scientific causes. And I've taken advantage of that fact that people listen, and that when we get maybe 10, 20, 100 Nobel laureates all say the same thing, people who can do something will sometimes then do it. Maybe not because we spoke to them directly, but because they realize that this is an issue that we're all involved in. And so the open access to the literature is something that I got involved in very early after I won the prize. And now you can see what's happening. The scientific literature is much more open access than it ever was. There are still a few holdout journals like Nature and so on that don't want to be open access, but open access is good. And so that's one of the things I've done.
Thank you. Your modesty is charming and disarming, both of you, I have to say. But let me come to you, Professor.
So let me just start by saying that of the 280 Nobel Prize laureates currently alive, Sir Rich Roberts is by far the most humanitarian and public-spirited of them all. He doesn't like me calling him sir. I did that deliberately. Amazingly. In my case, as the 7 espresso high wore off, I suddenly thought, what's this all about? Televisions in our living room, television crews in the living room. Why is this all this fuss? I'm still exactly the same person as I was 12 hours ago. Then I suddenly thought back when I was in my early 20s to how impressed I'd been by Nobel Laureates that I saw on television or met in person. And I thought they were just like rock stars. And it was a sudden realization that I have a responsibility to, because I can impress young people, I have this responsibility to, try to do this. And I also remembered back, so I knew Francis Crick, one of the great scientists of last century, and he had a red Lotus sports car. And as a 20-year-old, what really impressed me was not his great science, but the fact that he was a Nobel laureate with a red sports car. So I suddenly realized you need to be kind of fairly down to earth at the same time and really make people feel that any one of them could, with the right fortune, be a Nobel Prize laureate. In terms of the responsibility, one of the things I actually said is, I think on television, I'm scared to speak now because everyone will believe my nonsense. And that ended up coming back to haunt me because I was very, very involved in COVID at the very beginning. And my viewpoint was that it was like serious flu and not going to kill everybody, which in fact was absolutely true. And it's not because of the vaccine, it's because basically we have wonderful immune systems. Cities like New York that were hit really hard never got hit again. So I was right, but I got accused by many people as being wrong because they didn't like what I was saying. The establishment wanted the panic to be there. And brought back to me was, well, you said we shouldn't believe your nonsense. It's a difficult thing, but I definitely felt that it was my obligation by following the numbers to speak out. So it works both ways.
There is an obligation there, isn't there? But when you were speaking to the next potential prize winners, how do you advise them? Is there a blueprint? Is there a way they should go about it? What's the DNA?
Well, I think, when we were in the panel yesterday, pretty much all of us who had won the prize said it was luck, that we happened to be doing some good science. Nature didn't operate in the way that we thought it did, and so we made a big discovery. But we weren't looking for that discovery. One of the elements of discovery is it's not something you expect. And I think what I talk to kids about and to students is never set your sights on being a Nobel Prize winner. If it happens, great. Just concentrate on being a good scientist, on being the best human being you can, and you will have a good life. But if you set your sights on a Nobel Prize, I pretty much guarantee you will be disappointed and you will consider your life a failure when it's not. There are many people much smarter than me, much more genius-like, who don't have Nobel Prizes. I look up to them. I think they're great. And so I recognize it is luck. But, the secret of luck is to take advantage of it when it comes your way. And that was something I learned playing snooker when I was a young kid. I thought I was going to be thrown out of school, and I spent a lot of time playing snooker. And I actually thought I might become a professional snooker player. One day, an old gentleman came up to me and he said, you just made this shot, and it was a lucky shot, and then you messed up the next shot. And he said, the secret of luck, when you have a lucky break like that, you've got to focus twice as hard on the next shot. And that stayed with me throughout my life. We all have luck. Take advantage of it. Don't feel guilty because you have it and someone else doesn't. Take advantage of it.
Still playing snooker?
I play pool now because in my house I don't have a room big enough for a snooker table other than my bedroom. And for some reason my wife doesn't think that's where the snooker table should be.
Can't imagine why. Professor, there's no blueprint. Is that your advice to the next generation?
I think a blueprint for all of life is to do something you love doing, because you're going to end up doing it. So I heard about computers when I was 16. This is way back in the early 60s. And really fell in love with them. And that's what I wanted to do. And have been using computers ever since. So I think it's a good idea to actually, and I like typing on keyboards. I like playing with computers. I just like using my phone. It's all the same thing. So do something you like doing. So you're going to spend your life mostly doing that particular thing. The other thing is that Rich and I actually share a snooker background. In my case, I wasn't the best player, but when I was 14, grew up in South Africa, and I would go with my friends to play snooker. And one night, I came back at 5 a.m. and my mother was absolutely sure I'd been murdered or hit by a car or something like that. So she said, basically, you're obviously bored with school. Why don't you skip some years of school? She didn't really give me a choice. So I skipped a few years of school, and that probably completely changed my career. So in some cases, I was propelled by anti-snooker rather than snooker. But it is something that Rich and I have talked about in the past, and we actually share this background. But I think, going back, using fortune, I think it's very important to open yourself up to opportunities. It's also probably a good idea not to know what you're going to do. In other words, there was certainly a time when young people would have a 5-year plan. And I think a 5-year plan is probably a good idea for a country, maybe for a politician. But, if you plan your life today for the next 5 years, you're using information that you have today. In a year's time, you'll have much better information. So maybe plan a little bit ahead, but always be open. I mentioned Francis Crick earlier, really an amazing scientist. He said that you should always never be more than about 70% occupied. So you have 30% available to jump on something new when it comes along. That's also interesting advice. It's hard to follow. But I think there is fortune everywhere. There's also misfortune. I mean, the fact is that everyone in this room is incredibly lucky because many people in similar situations are dead now. And it's, I didn't cut myself shaving yesterday, and I didn't fall in the bath, and so on. At any moment in time, we've all avoided catastrophe. So we need to be very, very grateful. But I think luck comes to those who, when they see it, grasp it and not be scared. Oftentimes, what propels you is very uncertain at the beginning. When you get the opportunity, it's not a sure thing at all. So it's that ability to move into.
It's also good, I think, to look back on your own lives and see where luck took you one way as opposed to the other way. And I think after you do that, you start to realize the importance that luck can play in your life. It's well worth considering.
Just before we have to leave the stage in our conversation, very sadly, I want to ask 2 quick questions. When it comes to the role that governments can play in fostering, in nurturing or hothousing the next generation, the future innovators, those working on breakthroughs, what must they do? What would be your advice?
Well, I always feel that young children are where you need to start. Kids, they're curious, they're creative, they're innovative, they want to find out how the world works. And very often we set up school systems in which we knock out the creativity from these kids, and we absolutely should not do that. We want to give them every opportunity to learn. And I think you'd be surprised at how young people can be and kids can be. I had an interesting experience. I was at a school nearby talking to 11 and 12-year-olds about GMOs. And I'd been asked, and I gave about an hour's talk, and we had a discussion with the kids. And they'd all had to write to me afterwards and say what they thought about this meeting. And so a lot of the kids wrote back to me, and they said this was the first time they felt they'd ever been spoken to as though they were adults. And I thought this was a really devastating attack on the teachers. How could they not have known this? But the best of all was one girl wrote to me, and she said she'd gone home and talked to her parents, and they were anti-GMO. And she told them what I'd been saying, and at the end of the conversation with her, they changed their minds, and they became pro-GMO. And I thought, this is fantastic. Here's a way in which we can get to the young people and at the same time get to their parents and to the older people too. So I think kids, they're wonderful. We have to make sure we give them the opportunities when they're young.
Thank you. Professor?
I totally agree with Rich on that. In my case, I had an opportunity talking to a bunch of 6- and 7-year-olds in Portugal. I was telling them about my work on simulating protein motion, and one of the kids said, but what about the electrons and protons? And I was completely taken aback because that's a very relevant question. And then I spoke to their parent, and I said, well, had you been discussing it with the kid? He said, no, he watches a lot of YouTube. So I was really amazed. I think that the primary objective of school is a very low bar. When you leave school, you shouldn't hate learning, because you're going to have to spend the rest of your life learning. I also believe, and I'm a great fan of AI, that the way computers learn is by having a very ignorant teacher teaching him, and the teacher and the student learn at the same time, basically fake it till you make it. And I believe that somewhere in there's a new mode of teaching where it's not a learned teacher teaching the students, but student teachers and learning teachers work together. So I'm actually very optimistic, but I do think the young people are incredibly important. I worry that the number or the percentage of young people in the world is decreasing so rapidly. So, I think it's a great tragedy.
And lastly, I just want to talk to you about society. Let's zoom out, because when breakthroughs and innovations happen, I imagine they're not always well received. How do we get over that? And again, I presume it plays back into education. It's grassroots, but also communication at a government level to the masses.
Right. Well, some people think that we should get more scientists in government. I'm not sure I agree with that, because what I find is that when scientists go into government, they become politicians, which is not good. Rather, I think we as scientists need to learn to speak in language that the politicians, the general public, that everybody can understand. And I think this is not something that most scientists are ever taught how to do. And so we find only occasionally that there is a very good communicator who comes out of the scientific community. I believe we should really try to teach students how to communicate their results. I have something I call the grandmother test. And I always tell my students, you should go home, find your grandmother and tell her what you do every day, and tell her in words that she can understand. And the way you know whether she understands them is if she can then go and tell all her friends how smart you are and what you do every day. And I think this is very good. If you can learn to talk to people about your science, people who are not themselves scientists, but you can make them understand what you're doing, you've done a good job of communication.
Thank you, Professor.
So I again agree with Rich. I think that I again have a lot of hope for the future. The fact is that I have actually gone to ChatGPT and to Bard and said, please explain quantum mechanics to a 3-year-old. And it's actually really interesting. Or explain blockchain to a 10-year-old. And these explanations are actually amazingly good. It explained my own work to me in a very simple way. I think also what is good about these AI devices is that you access them privately. And this means that a head of state can get a second opinion without anyone thinking he's an idiot. And I actually believe that there's going to be any smart diplomat and head of state and governor should be asking these devices privately, not through their assistant, but themselves, what should I do? I remember visiting Seoul. Seoul has a very bad traffic problem. And just saying to ChatGPT, what should I do about the traffic in Seoul? And of course, I can't do anything about it. But the advice that came back was very, very interesting. And again, it may be stuff that everybody knows, but seeing it laid out, but it's amazing getting advice from a machine. It's actually much, much better than getting advice from a psychiatrist or from your mother or your grandmother. So it's coming from a very impartial source. So I have actually asked ChatGPT, I just had a fight with my wife, what do I do now? And the advice is really, really good.
What did it say? Get a snooker table?
No. Basically, it's obviously she's right, and that's a really important advice. In any case, it doesn't really matter if you're right, because you've got to get over this. And, consider this situation, consider why she was involved. It turns out that these AI machines actually have a very high emotional intelligence. They have in emotionally intelligence tests, they're scoring in the 90th percentile. Now, my guess is that the lowest 50% are men, and then the next 80% is women, but the machines are up there. And I think this is incredibly important because the advice is free, doesn't cost anything. If you like, it's a free second opinion to any situation in your life involving lawyers or medicine or doctors or emotional issues or mathematics and computer science and history. And if you're interested in how a certain word is pronounced in Arabic, you can take a picture of the word, put it in, and it will tell you how to pronounce it. And this is an incredibly empowering experience. So it's really changed my life, and I guess I'm a prophet now, but I can't help myself.
And on that note, sadly, we have to wrap up our conversation. And as much as we do love AI, we really love speaking in person to distinguished delegates like you. So thank you so much for being here today. Ladies and gentlemen, my Nobel Prize winners.
Thank you.
Thank you.